Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for joining us. Now, BlackRock is the largest asset management firm in the world, with asset under management amounting to something like $8 trillion. And the kind of message you're sending out has very important impact on industry as a whole. Now, in that context, could you tell us actually, what's the commitment? How deeply you are committed to ESG issue in your investment?
Of course, and let me just say thank you for having me. I wish I could be with you in person, but I guess we all have to get used to this, and I look forward to returning to Korea as soon as possible. Yes, it's a very good question. So as you rightly say, ESG considerations, although we used to call it something a little different, has been around actually for quite some time, maybe even for 20 years in the financial markets as a theme. But it has really been a niche theme, and it was mostly driven around specific values that people wanted to embrace and then find a way to reflect those values in products or in portfolios. It was value driven. What has changed in the last couple of years, and I would say it's been a moving timeline, but let's say about 5 years' time, that increasingly the old notion that you had to trade value for values, in other words, that there was a trade-off, that if you wanted to reflect your personal values in a portfolio, you would lose value, you would lose performance. That was the old paradigm. That paradigm has shifted thanks to a lot of research that people have done in the financial markets, but also in academia. And that research has shown increasingly clearly over the last couple of years that that's actually the wrong way to think about it. Then in reality, what happens is when you incorporate and integrate ESG considerations, sustainability considerations in your portfolio, the performance at a minimum, at a risk-adjusted level, actually increases. So in other words, it is no longer a matter of trading off value for values. And the way we try to capture this new state, which again is very much underpinned by empirical research, that we said, sustainability risk is investment risk. Climate risk is investment risk. In other words, if you don't incorporate ESG considerations into your portfolio, you will lose out on risk-adjusted performance and perhaps even nominal performance, certainly in the long run. And so that was an incredibly important change, because what that meant, irrespective of your personal values as an individual or as an asset manager, or indeed as a client, it became, in essence, a performance-driven consideration that started driving this. And so this has changed completely the position, notably of asset managers like BlackRock, because the moment you have conviction on this basic premise, it actually becomes our fiduciary duty to incorporate ESG considerations on behalf of our clients into our clients' portfolios. And that has really been the big change. And I would say the research on this has become increasingly clear, where as of a couple of years ago, you really couldn't make the case anymore for not including ESG considerations. And that drove our strategic pivot, which then ultimately, as you know, resulted in the big announcement that Larry Fink made, that the firm made in January of this year. And it's been a very fundamental change around how we operate as a firm, how we operate vis-a-vis our clients, how we operate internally, and how we operate as a large shareholder across the world in thousands of companies.
Great. I have seen Larry's letter or announcement made earlier this year. Very impressive. Now, how does that sort of affect the actual investment activities on the ground? Sometimes the CEO's vision, time to reach to the bottom, right?
So it affects very directly BlackRock in at least three ways. The first is that it led us to have full ESG integration on all the active products that we run. So by the end of this year, so within weeks, we will have every portfolio manager internally at BlackRock that runs an active platform will have been fully ESG integrated. That's a big change, which will, of course, over time, change the way these portfolio managers invest. So they become acutely aware of ESG risks in their portfolios by way of having all their portfolios ESG integrated with the help of our technology platform, Aladdin. The second thing, very importantly, is we launched a major initiative to offer more products, initially mostly in the index space. So we now have over 100 sustainable ETFs, which allow our clients to implement just about any portfolio solution that they're looking for in the index world entirely with sustainable ETFs. We've also made a big effort to launch new products in the active, in the alpha seeking space, in the sustainable world. We are now entering into the private market space where we will innovate and offer new products. And then the third piece, very importantly, we've evolved in terms of how we exercise our vote in all the companies we hold, where in particular climate now becomes an important consideration in terms of how we position ourselves as the world's largest shareholder. Not just climate, ESG is more than the environment, it's certainly more than climate. And as you know, particularly in the last couple of years, many of the issues around societal positions, the S in ESG has of course taken up much more importance. And my view is that COVID actually accelerates all these trends. You know, one could have argued, perhaps at the outset of this crisis, that perhaps the focus on COVID, the focus on combating COVID, will somehow displace ESG considerations. But I see on the ground, frankly, the opposite is happening. If anything, concerns around resilience, which have been very much brought to the forefront by COVID, concerns about long-term performance, all these things have actually accelerated these trends that I just described.
Yeah, that's great. Out of ESG, ESG has the three components, ESG, right? Much attention has been paid to E-part, especially these days, climate change, dealing with climate change, and so forth. Now, of course, as you have just mentioned, or that COVID-driven increase in social inequalities has attracted much attention as well. Any comment on G? G governance, corporate governance is clearly an important issue for sustainable progress, growth of a corporation, or even a country level. That's governance is also important. At macro level, I should say. But any particular areas where you attach greater importance with regard to governance factor?
Sure. Well, let's look at the world pre-COVID and post-COVID, or with COVID. Pre-COVID, interestingly, if you look at the empirical work that was done in universities and think tanks, as well as in the financial sector, if you look at the state of research about, let's say, 2-3 years ago, actually what you find is that the G part in ESG showed the most compelling case for an improvement of risk-adjusted performance if you incorporate G considerations in your portfolio, which intuitively, if you think about it, is not that surprising, right? A company that is well-run, well-governed, has good governance, good risk controls, has diversity of mind represented in its leadership, even in its board. All these things intuitively lead you to the conclusion that those companies should outperform companies that are badly governed. Now, as you rightly said, climate has a special position In the E part, we now know how much damage climate can inflict on assets and on portfolios. So that case is very clear as well. But the G part was actually very clear empirically going into COVID. COVID, of course, has made everything even more clear, both at the company level, but even at a country level. Think of countries that have governed this crisis well versus countries that have governed it badly, and think of the difference that you have in terms of cost in human lives, cost in economic damage, etc. So I think the experience of COVID has actually reinforced the importance of governing successfully and governing efficiently, whether it's at a company level, at a societal level, or indeed at a country level. So I think, again, this is a perfect example of something that was in place before, had pretty robust empirical underpinnings, and has the case of which has been strengthened by the actual experience of COVID.
BlackRock is already a big investor in major Korean operations. Now, given the fact that a relatively better performed region and country like Korea, that be this weight, for example, in your portfolio be raised after this incident, or is not? Is something separate?
No, I think generally speaking, Asia looks attractive to us right now. And Korea is very much in that category. I think in addition, if you see what's happening in Korea, that you're also making your own independent decisions, triggering growing interest in sustainable investing. If you look at what the national pension services are doing right now in Korea, asking for or demanding or implementing greater public disclosure on ESG standards. And if I understand it correctly, also has introduced a new stewardship code that is very much driven by ESG considerations. So that will have, if you like, a mutually reinforcing effect, right? The more your own asset base, and you're very important, Korea is a very important participant in the capital markets, not least through your pension schemes, that as you incentivize, in a sense, more ESG-oriented, ESG-enhanced investing, that will, of course, also, in a sense, in a positive way, fuel some of these asset allocation considerations and decisions that we will see coming from other countries. There's no doubt in my mind that our clients worldwide, generally speaking, are looking for opportunities to invest in a sustainable way. If you look at the performance we've had and the flows we've had coming into this large range of sustainable index products that I mentioned early on, it's been extraordinary. It's exceeded our expectations, both on flows, but also on performance. Something like 94% of our sustainable ETFs have outperformed the relative comparable traditional ETFs that we offer. Right, that tells you something. So our clients are clearly switching from traditional ETFs to sustainable ETFs, and we've made an effort to try to offer these at the same cost. So there is no cost consideration that drives this asset allocation decision. So I think to the extent that your large asset holders in Korea bring more of an ESG consideration into it, that will attract capital in and of itself. So these two trends, I think, are mutually reinforcing. The more you do as a country in terms of disclosure, in terms of incentives, the more you're going to see flows into these products. And I suspect even in your local market, what will happen is, you will see growing interest in issuing ESG enhanced products that, again, in turn will attract more capital. Look, it is now 10 o'clock here in Europe, Thursday morning. At this point, I would say that the scenario that you laid out looks like the most likely, although we need to really emphasize that this election is not over yet. It is not clear who's going to be the winner. But I would agree with you, the most likely scenario at this point, when I look at the dynamics and the states that are left to count, is that indeed former Vice President Biden will be the next president of the United States, one way or another, whether it's in 2 days or in 2 weeks, at the latest in January. And we will most likely at this point, although there is a small outside chance that the outcome could be different, but most likely would have the Senate with a very thin Republican majority. So that indeed has repercussions, I think, particularly around fiscal policy. If indeed it is a divided government, which again looks like the most likely outcome right now, the amount of really game-changing large fiscal projects that are both there to support the economy, but also very much to transform the economy. If you look at some of former Vice President Biden's campaign platform elements, you will see that particularly around the transition to a net zero emissions economy, there are very big projects to transform the economy. That will be difficult in a divided government scenario, very difficult. So I think there'll be limits to radical changes that we might expect around fiscal policy. And that's just a reality that we have to accept. On the other hand, I would say, now I speak as a European, it has been very difficult to see the United States not embracing cooperative approaches to global problems. We are facing some very severe global problems. COVID, of course, is the most obvious one. Climate change is the other one, but there are many others. I think of inequality. I think of the challenges around technology, digitalization. And so I think one of the changes, hopefully, no matter how the government is set up in that scenario you laid out, would be a United States government and a United States that would re-engage again more constructively on the global scene to tackle some of these problems. That, by the way, does not mean that some of the difficult tension points will disappear. I would very much expect the relationship between the United States and China to remain challenging. It is a relationship that I would describe now as, great power competition, perhaps great power confrontation. I think the key is to avoid a scenario where it becomes one of great power conflict. So we will have many areas where many of the same tension points that we have today will remain. But at the same time, I think we would see in that scenario a United States, the most powerful country in the world, trying to find ways to re-engage and to be a more constructive player again, a difficult player, a challenging player, but a more constructive player around many of the global issues and challenges that we face today.
Okay, thank you very much for taking your time to be with us today. I wish you all the best and hope to keep in touch.
Thank you very much. Stay healthy, and I look forward to coming back to Korea soon.
Okay, great. Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.